I believe that the only excuse we have for being musicians and for making music in any fashion is to make it differently, to perform it differently, to establish the music's difference vis-a-vis our own difference. I couldn't imagine a life in which I would not be surrounded by music, which shelters you from the world, which protects you, which keeps you at a certain distance from the world. Because I think that the only advantage that any artist has, the only thing that any artist can really write about, and all artists do write about whether they know it or not, is that distance from the world. I do realize it, and I know that I obtain it through media. And I know that I would have been very unhappy as a 19th century man.
Certainly Gould is one of the most...
He's been dead a quarter of a century. And we still have people interested. Not many people on this planet get to be around like Glenn is and continues to be.
One, take one.
I played Bach since my childhood. Of course, we all played a lot of Bach in our own way. And of course, somebody like that who suddenly gave us clarity and absolutely unaffected sort of Bach structure.
But from the perspective of the United States and internationally, here was a totally unknown person who suddenly appeared on record in this phenomenal performance. And that seemed to come out of nowhere.
Okay, let's go. Want to do the whole thing again? Yeah.
Had there been music in your family?
Well, not professionally for about 3 generations. Our one claim to fame musically is that Eduard was a first cousin of Mother's grandfather.
Good lineage.
Well, unfortunately, I don't like his piano concerto, because if I did, it would be the publicity stunt of the century.
Had you always been able to read music?
Well, I learned very young. I learned when I was perhaps 3 or 4, you know. I could read music before I could read words.
That's where the piano was, over there. That was like the music room.
When did you actually start studying?
Oh, I was playing when I was about 3 or 4, but just diddling away, really. And I didn't become very serious about it, I think, until I was perhaps 10 or 11 when I really began to work. At that time, I would say, with the idea of a career, rather vaguely.
Yes, the piano was here. This was full of recordings and scores and that sort of thing. Glenn was unbelievably untidy, of course. The amazing thing was he seemed to know where everything was. I would ask him about a recording. He'd say, oh, I think it's in that pile there. And it nearly always was. This was where Glenn did a lot of work, a lot of work.
Do you remember what you played at your first concert?
Well, let me see. But I think the first recital was when I was about 14. Yes, I think I played a brace of Bach fugues, and some Haydn, some Beethoven, some Chopin, some Mendelssohn, some Liszt.
Which you haven't played since in public?
Which I haven't played since in public.
Were you nervous?
Oh, not nearly as nervous then as I am today.
Really?
Oh, no.
Why?
Well, you know, it was all part of the game. In those days, I mean, one was sort of blissfully unaware of the responsibilities of this thing entailed. I just wish I could feel like that again.
Glenn didn't have any brothers or sisters, and I thought that was a great pity because I think if he had had some sibling rivalry, it might have been very good for him. But Glenn was a very precious child. Remember, his mother had tried for years to have a child, but she suffered miscarriages. So she was maybe 43 when Glenn was born, this child was a gift from God, and she wanted Glenn to be a musician. She taught him from when he was about 3 until he was 9 or 10, and she expected him to sing. The only problem was, as he got older, he couldn't stop singing. Glenn used to work quite late at night, so when I came here, not too long afterwards, his parents would gravitate upstairs and then they would go to bed. And unless they were very sound sleepers, I don't know how they could possibly have slept against Glenn's playing and also his singing. And I think he forgot where he was. He was in a trance. We were going on until 1 o'clock in the morning, until 2 o'clock in the morning, till 3 o'clock in the morning. And I'd sometimes say, Glenn, I've got to go. And he'd look at me and say, oh, you can't go now, you can't go now. And he would go right back into his trance again.
Which is off the floor, which is, as you know, extraordinarily low. And without that, I would simply have to commandeer the nearest chair and cut some of the legs off. There's nothing else I can do.
Have you had to do that?
Well, before I had this chair designed, I did that from hall to hall, and it was a very discomforting procedure because I usually had to pay for the chairs that I later drove.
Who did the sawing?
Oh, my father finally decided.
Oh, you brought father along to the sawing.
Oh, yes.
I went to Guerrero when I was 12. Glenn had gone when he was 11, so he'd been with him a year ahead of me. The initial ideas came from Guerrero, and then Glenn developed them in his own way. Guerrero sat fairly low at the keyboard, fairly close to the keyboard. As I remember his playing in those classes, we thought that Glenn was purposely mimicking Guerrero for the fun of it.
Roaming the halls. Along came this gangly kid sitting in a position we'd never seen a pianist sit before. And out came this great music making and a new touch on the Beethoven concerto. His musicianship was already there and way beyond our 22 years.
The tapping that Guerrero taught us to do was to gain independence of the fingers. There's no lifting of fingers. So by tapping, you get the feeling of the pressure at the tip of the finger, but the finger just bounces back by itself. So here's what it sounds like with both hands. We all learned this detached finger technique from sing all the time, and he always had to conduct. He might have one finger on the steering wheel, the other was conducting, and there were times when he had no fingers on the steering wheel, and I'd think, oh, Glenn, where are we going, you know?
He used to phone every night at 11 o'clock and play me the bit he'd just written. He was composing his big string quartet. I suppose he had enormous control over himself and was possum. His mother was mouse. He himself was spaniel. And I was fawn.
Did he ever tell you that he loved you?
Yes.
And did you love him?
Yes.
Was he very romantic?
Sort of.
Gould was in the kind of bind that a lot of artists have found themselves in. They yearn for that kind of stability and companionship and particular kind of meaning that comes from a domestic life. But really, it's not compatible with their art. There you have the contradiction right there.
Well, this is a pretty unusual and pleasant rehearsal studio you have here, Glenn.
It is a nice spot, Gordon. That's where I get most of the work done.
You're wearing your famous gloves, eh? I see.
Well, that's an occupational thing, you know. I simply have to protect my
Yes, your hands are very responsive.
Ridiculous as it seems.
Glenn, your recent European tour was an immense success. The reviews that reached us here were just very thrilling. How many countries did you play in?
I played in Russia, Germany, and Austria. The bulk of the tour was in Russia, 8 concerts in Moscow and Leningrad.
The importance of the Russian tour can't possibly be exaggerated. This was in 1957, post-Stalinist Khrushchev Soviet Union. Of course, this was in the middle of the Cold War. And that was a very, very deeply troubled part of the world at that time.
It was quite terrible, in one word. And the government, of course, was very insecure. Although they wanted to give a feeling of absolute control. There wasn't absolute control, but they tried to exercise it. It was so uninspiring too, and so false, unbelievably false.
How about the social side of your trip, Glenn? Did you travel about, meet any Russians and such things?
Well, I should say that you were much too thoroughly chaperoned by your interpreter to do much traveling about on your own. I did meet a lot of the Russians, especially the musicians.
What sort of music did you play?
Well, I did fairly general programs, with the exception that I played a certain amount of music which is not, I think, too often heard in Russia, and did so deliberately.
For the Soviets, the music of Bach was seen as effectively evangelical music. So while not completely banned, Bach was more or less banished from the concert stage and from the music culture largely.
Actually, the hall was half empty because nobody knew him, of course. Said, oh, Bach evening, you know. In Russia, of course, there's a lot of respect for Bach, but the whole evening of Bach in a big hall, some people came, I came.
And people started going to the telephones outside and phoned all their friends. Quick to come to this recital. We've never heard anything like this. This man's a genius. By the time of the second half, the hall filled up.
For me, what I remember, it was perfect. Just his physical gifts, you know, of absolute control of what he's doing, audio control too, all this connected. So we thought, well, we never quite heard Bach how this should be played.
His speak to the Russian people, they describe Gould's visit as a Martian coming to Earth or coming to their world. He had the appearance of this consumed genius, and I think there's something that appealed deeply to the Russian sensibilities in that, this complete devotion to his art and complete perfection in his art.
We were so isolated, basically, and our scale of values was so limited, you see. All the same, we felt that that was quite an extraordinary event, because the personality of this young person was
The last time I was here was after Glenn had left. I came once with him. He had to pick things up here. He was striking out on his own, and I used to make a few suggestions to him about his parents, and I don't think he appreciated it somehow. I felt his parents had done so much for him. Their whole lives had evolved around Glenn. So I felt that they were getting older and that he had to worry about them a bit.
Small boy with chicken feathers and straw in his hair. He could play the piano like a whirlwind, and he did his first piece that he did, he recorded for us, which no one had ever done, the Goldberg Variations, which was on the bestseller list. And here it was a bestseller list with an unknown, as I say, really a small-town boy. You know, I mean, they expect you to have a Mountie uniform or something.
My husband and I were driving down Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles, and suddenly my husband leaned over towards the radio, which was on, and said, "Oh, shh, pull over, pull over, pull over. I have to hear this." And it was the Bach Goldberg Variations, and we listened to the entire thing. Of course, it turned out to be Glenn Gould. What Glenn had done is taken the piece, metaphorically cut it apart and put it together as if he was taking a clock apart and then putting it back together in a very strange way. And no one had ever done that before. And it was a very remarkable way of thinking about that music. I personally didn't like it too much because I think it destroyed what Mr. Bach wanted. But I can see that any musician would be fascinated by it. And of course, also the playing. The playing was superb, beyond superb. A few months later, Leonard Bernstein was conducting the premiere of a new work of my husband's, it was Time Cycle. And a very tall man in a very long overcoat and gloves and scarf on came down the aisle and said to my husband, "Excuse me, I've been wanting to meet you. My name is Glenn Gould." And my husband turned around and said, "Oh my goodness, you're Glenn Gould. I just heard your fantastic Goldberg Variations." And Glenn said, "Well, I think you're the best pianist alive today."
Glenn greatly admired Lucas. He thought he was an absolutely exceptional person, an exceptional composer, exceptional musician, exceptionally intelligent.
Glenn would call regularly and talk to Lucas, and sometimes Lucas wouldn't be there, and then he would talk to me. And after a while, he would be talking longer to me than he was to Lucas. Well, he was enormously engaging. He was charming, he was funny, he was tremendously intelligent, just so much fun to talk to.
When Gould first became a sensation in the mid and late 50s, this was a time of great cultural ferment in New York, in literature and in music and in painting. And a lot of musicians in his situation would have been thrilled to be able to hang out with the Bernsteins and the Fosses. He always kept his distance from it. Rather than attend glittering New York parties, he seemed more interested in just getting back home.
I don't think Glenn ever wanted to be part of any group. It was absolutely anathema to him. That you use in that way is self-generating. The more energy you use, the more energy you get.
It's most important But you bring...
New York bothers me almost not at all, but Toronto is here.
When it came to touring, Glenn Gould was infamous for canceling performances. I remember when I approached Walter Hamburger and said, Walter, I want Glenn for the opening of my second season with the Brahms First Piano Concerto. But I must tell you, Walter, if he lives up to his reputation and doesn't show, I'm going to sue him. So Walter said, don't worry, he won't do that to you. Well, sure enough, he played that performance and canceled the next performance he was supposed to go to further west in Canada.
If you are playing a concert every second or third night for a month, this seems, in a way, a reasonably normal way to live at the time. It's only when one gets away from it that one realizes what a crazy artificial existence it is. I can only say that I feel something like I did as a child when it was Labor Day and the next day meant going back to school. It was a completely horrible feeling. It was a feeling of being consigned to the netherworld, you know?
Gould hated concert life, musically, temperamentally, logistically. He hated being dragged from city to city and hotel to hotel, unfamiliar pianos, conductors he doesn't know. He canceled concerts whenever he could. He canceled whole tours because he just couldn't face it.
As a musician, and when I'm with so many of my colleagues, and when we're talking about various cities, or, you know, I just played in Amsterdam, or I just played here in Berlin, or this or that, and what do we talk about? There's a great restaurant in this city, and we, you know, we talk about exactly where it was, or there's a great museum and all this and that. With Glenn, when you talked about a certain city, all he could think of was, oh yes, that's the city where I was caught in a draft, and I felt this draft come to my shoulder, and all of a sudden I couldn't move my shoulder, and then that developed into a terrible flu, and you know, every memory that he had was just a bad one, and it was so sad to me. I don't think he enjoyed 1 minute of his life when he was concertizing.
Glenn used to get very intense over certain things. And in the days in which he was giving concerts, I felt he needed a complete break. I love Shakespeare, and he loved Shakespeare too. So I said, well, why don't we read Shakespeare together? Well, he thought this was an absolutely wonderful idea. His favorite play was Richard II, and you can guess who played Richard. He always felt that I made a great John of Gaunt. But then we got on to other things. We started reading Oscar Wilde, and eventually we got to improvisations. I think this is all very good for him. Certainly, we loved it.
He was such a quirky, strange kind of guy for a classical musician. This was a guy who, you know, sat around with his feet up all the time and dressed in funny costumes and, you know, played characters in funny voices. And, you know, Herbert von Karajan didn't do that kind of thing. And for people who don't have much interest in classical music, and even for some people who are part of the classical music world, he provides some relief from this conservatism of the classical music business.
Ah, Creole gal, how you love your bacchanal. Ah, you see them Creole gal, boy, they love their bacchanal. I mean, they move their hips in a funny way, dance all night and sleep all day. Then they start a polishing. Lordy Lord, how they love romancing. When you see Miss Dorothy, what a personality. Yes, she is super fine. All the Cuervos fall in line when she move them hips in a funny way. Dance all night and sleep all day. Then she start a polishing. Lordy Lord, how she love romancing.
There is one picture of him that has always been in my mind, where he's sitting in a room with large windows behind him. He's facing right at the camera, and his head has dropped a little bit. I think it was just true Glenn Gould.
He was somewhat of a darling in the media. Not only was he being reviewed in all the music magazines, but popular interest magazines like Maclean's, like Life magazine, even Vogue and Glamour. Not just because of his playing, but also because of his rather striking appearance and personality.
If I may, I'd like to touch on a topic that might be a little tender, I don't know, and that is when a critic plays up your eccentricities on stage and off, does it infuriate you? Does it hurt your feelings?
No, it doesn't hurt my feelings in the slightest.
Well, he was pragmatic, and he was a businessman. He knew perfectly well that the image was going to help sell records.
Now, before we came up to the studio, you asked if it was going to be properly heated. It doesn't bother me because we're all friends, but does this make you feel better?
Well, it does, yes. Even if they aid only the mental capacity to carry on, you know, these things are psychological aids, and as such, they cannot be overvalued.
So often when an individual is so heavily endowed with a particular kind of genius, these other kinds of personality aberrations come with that. And I think it was probably interpreted in some circles as a crass marketing ploy of some kind to wear the coat, hum through the recordings, and so on.
I remember his mother phoning me. She said, "I'm really disturbed by what's happening with Glenn. Do you think this is going to be all right?" And I said, "This is what happens in the big time. And when the publicity people get a hold of something, they latch onto things that perhaps are extracurricular. I hope he doesn't fall into some trap, that's all." And of course, they did cash in on some of the idiosyncrasies because it sells tickets, unfortunately.
You just focus on the different ways he presents himself. There's no end to the interest. Why do people all over the world find themselves drawn to Gould? It's not just because he was a great player. It's because his life is itself a performance that people can't take their eyes away from.
In every age, there are styles of performance that one expects to hear. And in the period in which Glenn Gould started to play, there were a number of great virtuosos playing. There was Horowitz and Serkin and Rubinstein and many, many others. And he definitely went against the grain of those players because he went inside the music and tried to go inside the composer's mind. And then when he came out on the other side, the piece was so thoroughly internalized that I think he went beyond identifying with the composer, and he felt a total identity of himself with the music that he played.
Glenn often recorded pieces with different articulation. He would change some things, and very often the tempi would be quite different from what he had done on an earlier recording. Just to give you an example is the way he plays the Turkish rondo. This quite surprises me because usually this is played at a fairly good pace. Glenn does.
A Canadian composer, Oscar Moravec, wrote a piece for Glenn Gould to play it. Now, I don't know what the piece was, but the story goes that Glenn Gould starts playing, and Oscar, who was an ebullient person, stood up and said, "No, Glenn, it's not that way, it's this way." And then Gould supposedly got it from the piano and said, "Oscar, please sit down. You don't understand your own piece."
Another piece that surprised me was Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, which we're all so familiar with. And here, Glenn chooses to play at a faster tempo than usual and keep it absolutely strict. There's no rubato. There's nothing to show changes of harmony. It's absolutely the same all the way through. And it really surprised me when I heard what he did with this.
Gould always said that why would I make another recording of a Mozart piano concerto if it was going to sound like every other recording of a Mozart piano concerto? Or, for that matter, if it was going to sound like any other recording I had previously made? What would be the point? And of course, that's hugely true. And I think that's one of the reasons the classical music culture at a certain point became a bit sort of dry and a bit museum-like. You know, the performances all sounded the same. You knew exactly what you were going to hear. You were going to hear a wonderful virtuosic performance, undoubtedly, and that was of some value in itself, listening to a recording or listening to a concert. But what Gould said is that, yeah, this needs to be something new. You need to bring a new perspective, new ideas. And don't worry unduly about the details of the written text. The composer, him or herself, very often wasn't unduly concerned about the details of the text. So that's a longer-standing influence, I think, certainly for me, and I think all musicians and pianists take that from Gould.
The Canadian pianist Glenn Gould is to be soloist now. Leonard Bernstein conducting the New York Philharmonic in a performance of the Piano Concerto No. 1 in D minor by Brahms. I think Mr. Bernstein will have something to say to the audience, so down to the stage.
Performance of the Brahms D minor concerto. I cannot say I am in total agreement with Mr. Gould's. And this raises who is the boss, the soloist or the conductor? I'm conducting. But I must take seriously anything he conceives. I have only once before had to submit to a soloist wholly new and incompatible. I accompanied Mr. Gould. This time,
Now, I've never in my life heard of a situation where a conductor comes out on the stage and said, I don't agree with what the soloist is doing, but I'll go along with it. You just don't do that. I mean, as your role as a conductor when you're accompanying is to accompany the soloist. Can't always have the same mindset about how the music should go. That's what makes music making so exciting.
When he played the Brahms D minor with Leonard Bernstein, the New York Philharmonic, there were howls of derision from certain critics in New York. I mean, one of them said, Glenn Gould is a very great performer, but at the moment he's quite unfit for public performance. And another one, famous one by Harold Schoenberg of the New York Times, indicated that Glenn played it slowly because he was incapable of playing it faster. His technique wasn't good enough, which, of course, was preposterous.
After Gould left concert life, he knew that he wanted to do other things, but he wasn't entirely certain, I don't think, at the beginning exactly what he wanted to do. He talked about composing, he was interested in broadcasting, he was interested in writing, and these were new ventures for him, and he was learning as he was going.
Glenn, your voluntary switch from the concert stage to the electronic media is very possibly a pioneering step. I understand that it's even gone so far that you're now producing shows.
When Glenn came into the studio, he had a pile of records under this arm and a pile of papers and everything else at that arm, and he walked over to the counter in this control room and he handed me a script.
East coast of Hudson's Bay, this flat
I don't go, let me say
country
this again, I don't
frightened
go
me a
for this
little,
northmanship bit at all.
because it just seemed endless.
One of the first things that I did was a program called The Idea of North. It was about the North, and I found there some rather extraordinary human beings, people who have gone north, not simply because it offered time and a half pay or because they had to escape from something inside themselves that was eating at them and making urban life untenable.
That's why I find radio documentary especially so very fascinating, because one can make a statement about the human condition by virtue of the way in which you can define it through using the human voice.
We had a wonderful time doing the show, and I think it speaks for itself. And then we went on to do other shows, and obviously, by this point, Glenn and I had built up quite a solid relationship.
Wait a minute, maybe 7, we could cut back to 7.
Lorne, of course, was a leading technician, and he did a lot of work with Glenn. But it was difficult because Glenn worked very slowly but very meticulously, and he would only accept the very best.
Same difference.
And if he felt that he hadn't taken the right approach, he would want to do it again.
Okay, let me hear that last bar again.
And this is extremely demanding for everyone else concerned.
Now, tell me, can we get in on the upbeat? Would that be the easiest? Go back about 2 bars and I'll show you what
Gould was very much pushing the envelope in terms of the available technology of the day. And Lorne was a very willing and very competent assistant to him in that process.
Do you want me to physically cut this, or do you want
Yeah,
to just
I
roll
might as
it
well
out?
take it out and put it up on the machine. Whatever. But you're right on the note, right?
Yeah.
They spent hundreds of hours together working in the close confines of the studio to get these programs right. And they eventually became very close friends.
I mean, I was away from home quite a lot. I mean, I got to a point where I'd come home and my kids would call me sir. There were times when I would just want to get away and be by myself and have some room to think. And quite frequently, rightly or wrongly, I would go across and sit in the pub across the road. Me again. Yeah.
In my view, Glenn was a very lonely person, and he knew lots of people for sure. He knew lots of people on the telephone. But that's quite different to having real friends. But he was somebody who showed you what he wanted to show of himself at that time, or what he felt he could. But there was also that other part, which was hidden, which was not evident, but one knew was there.
Gould himself was so secretive about his private life that he encouraged people to think that there was some awful dark secret there. And the notion of Gould being this ascetic person, this asexual person, you know, Gould exaggerated all that for public consumption. Of course, the big dark secret turns out to be that he just had comparatively normal private, you know, relations with women of a rather ordinary kind.
So I just basically rummaged through some closets and came up with one box especially that had some albums in it and some papers. I don't think anyone's touched it for 35, 40 years. So these were taken, it says here, in June of '68. And so here's my mother and Glenn on this ferry. My mother looking very, and Glenn looking very happy, and they were sort of a chic couple in a way.
I had more or less left my husband, and the marriage was over, as far as I was concerned, and I thought, well, yes, I am going to marry Glenn, and he wanted the children and me to come to Toronto and start divorce proceedings, etc. And he had already contacted lawyers to see how it could best be done. However, my husband had an enormous ego and was not at all sure that I was going to be doing this. So when I left, I said, you're not taking this very seriously. You know I'm going to go off to Toronto now with the children, and I'm marrying Glenn Gould. And he said, don't be ridiculous. You're not going to marry him. I'll see you next weekend. Have fun.
I remember Glenn saying that she was coming with the children. And finally, the day they came, Glenn was waiting with anticipation, and then he just let it slip. Well, of course, they're moving here. He was absolutely devoted to her, and I suspect she was to him.
Here, for instance, is a shot of Glenn and my mother walking down the road in this sort of desolate area, very beautiful but desolate. And here is that famous dusty, dirty Chevy Impala. I know we had one too, so I'm not sure if it was Glenn's or ours, but and that's the sort of typical, really uninteresting motorhome environment that Glenn favored. I think, anything pretentious made him ill, frankly. So, which I understand, which I totally understand.
I'm not a great travel person. I'd just as soon not be in a car driving around. But the children loved it, and Glenn loved it. So he loved going on car trips and taking the children to Muskoka and showing them all sorts of things. You could always tell when a lake was coming up because the mountains would start looking blue. I still remember that. He loved children. He would have made a wonderful father.
I have scattered memories. I think probably the first thing I think of is his very, very red hands. I think that was the thing that I noticed first as a child, because, he used to soak his hands. I do remember the move. It was a little hard. I do remember that. And I remember staying in this strange sort of hotel before we moved into a house that overlooked a graveyard. And that was sort of my first memory. It was certainly traumatic at first, but Glenn was very warm and very caring, and my experiences with him, they were great.
He loved animals, and within weeks, he had found a real collie dog, or collie as he called it, and Glenn loved playing with it, and he loved to get the children to play with it. One day, however, Baffy, as he was called. He bit Glenn. That wasn't so funny. And he then gave us another dog, a border collie.
Schedule.
You're at the peak of room sound, and then you start to back off until you get to...
But what became unexpected fruit of that was this defense of recorded music as the reality of music. He happened to come along at a time when the technology for recording music was really starting to take off, and really got behind that as a real advocate and innovator.
There, and then get back out just before the double bars get that back to whatever is our...
Gould had some very fanciful theories about what the possibilities of recording and broadcasting technologies were. They were fanciful in the 1960s. They are simply how we do business today in the 21st century.
You know, I have a feeling that the end result of all our labors in the recording studio It's not going to be some kind of autocratic finished product such as we turn out now, but it's going to be a rather more democratic assemblage now. I think we're going to make kits, and I think we're going to send out these kits, and we're going to say do it yourself, and be in fact your own editor, be in a sense your own performer.
Of course, this just sounded lunatic in the 60s, but in essence, that's not only what we can do now on our desktops, but we do.
That's pretty good.
You know, you hear these stories about someone re-editing, you know, a Star Wars movie to take out a character they don't like. That is a Gouldian kit.
Well, you are a strange breed of recreative musical artist, Glenn. I mean, you're in the record business and the radio business and the television business. Didn't you recently do a show on the pop singer Pet Clark?
I did indeed. It was my first and quite probably last foray into the whole field of folk rock, or whatever they're calling it these days. It was great fun to do.
Okay, chickadees, here's the one you've been asking for, and tonight it's specially dedicated to Paul from Doris. Pet Clark with that question we've all been asking.
He loved to listen to this music while driving in his car. He would turn Petula Clark up full blast, as he describes, while driving into the Canadian North.
I walk alone and wonder who am I?
I contrived to match my driving speed to the distance between relay outlets, came to hear it most hours, and in the end to know it, if not better than the soloist, at least as well, perhaps, as most of the sidemen who were booked for the date. After several hundred miles of this exposure, I checked into the hotel at Marathon and made plans to contemplate Petula.
I thought it was a bit tongue-in-cheek, you know. I didn't think he'd really, really meant it. Because, you know, pop music, classical music, there's the great divide, you know.
I do think it started from genuine admiration for her and interest in her music, and she may have been one of those women that he was sort of half in love with from afar. I think Barbra Streisand falls into that category, and maybe Mary Tyler Moore, whose TV show he was always videotaping for some reason.
When you're alone and life is making you lonely, you can always go downtown.
I think the main interest in that project, though, was he had some sort of sociological comments that he wanted to make about pop music, and so there's that larger theme that drew him to the project.
It is a strange connection, and at the same time, why not? It's a real regret for me not having met him. We would have got on very well, and who knows, we may have brought something out in one another that would have been interesting.
It may have been a very arbitrary and sort of post-Freudian glance at folk rock, and I don't intend to do it again. It was my first and last attempt, but it was great fun.
Jim, I'm back at the third one. Opening up the backs now.
Okay, as soon as you're ready, if Glenn would give us a test of that.
Okay. He hated going to New York and doing the recordings. What they tried to do is set up a remote recording studio in Toronto. And Glenn bought all this equipment. At the time, it was state of the art. And Lauren asked me to help. And that's how I got involved. I was just arms and legs.
Okay, there's about 90 for you.
Okay, let's try that then, please.
Same thing again?
Same thing.
The arrangement was that he could record in Toronto with the condition that he had a proper place to record in. Well, this, of course, for Glenn was an open invitation for him, and CBS would pay him for doing the recordings here.
Hello, Glenn.
Okay, so you're going to buy the test.
It was a strange feeling to be going to a recording session at Eaton's department store. And of course the store was closed, and there was a guard who came to open the door. And then we had to walk through the entire first floor. I remember walking through the lingerie department. That was such a strange feeling. Going to the elevator, coming up to the 7th floor, and I walk in and there's this old auditorium in the middle of this department store. I could not believe it. I remember seeing the grand pianos and all the microphones, everything set up, and I started clapping my hands because that's how one can tell a little bit about acoustics. And it felt great. It was resonant and all that. And then Glenn went to the piano and started playing, and I love the sound in here, and I realized he was right. This is a great place to record.
Okay, insert 1, take 2.
We usually started recording around 11 at night, and the sessions went till 4, or a couple of times went till 5 in the morning. I never really realized what a great pianist he was until we started recording together. I was mesmerized, and I could not believe the technique that he had. It was absolutely extraordinary. And in all the times that all the hours we spent recording, I don't think we ever had to do a take again because he missed a note. I don't think he knew what it was to miss a note. It was absolute perfection.
That had better work.
I remember one particular take of the slow movement of the E major, the third movement of the E major sonata, and it was really a wonderful take from beginning to end. It could have been used, the entire take, without any kind of splicing. But somehow that didn't sit very well with Glenn, because after all, this is a recording, and recordings are made to be spliced and to be put together. So no matter how good it was, we had to do something a little different in this bar. No, let's use this bar, another take for this particular bar. And I found that that was kind of a little bit strange, I thought.
It isn't really prepared enough for the cadence part. I should have gotten the soft pedal on a little earlier.
I would say probably the late 60s, early 70s was sort of the point in Gould's life where the most things were going the most right at the same time. He was enormously prolific in terms of the amount of recordings he was putting out. He was already deeply into a very innovative kind of radio. Cornelia Foss had moved to Toronto. Obviously, that was a very close relationship of the kind that he had never had before. Artistically speaking, and in some ways personally speaking, that was sort of his best and most productive time, where these control issues were paying some dividends, shall we say.
Take down 1 and 2. Now the opposite.
Glenn liked to control the situation. Mind you, he didn't try to control people.
Take down 2, just leave 1.
But he liked to control situations, particularly the ones that involved him. When we were doing editing and stuff on tapes, I mean, yes, I did all the editing, but he did all the marking and decided what takes went where.
This is take 1.
To be honest, Glenn was a bit of a control freak.
No, I don't. Hold it. Let me see. Start in the middle position with 1, tight shot.
He'd created this world for himself where he could control it. And it was demanding. If you work for him, you were expected to give a lot. And he knew it. He drove himself hard and he drove other people hard.
Don't make 1 too loud. Okay, drop 2 slowly. So that on the last chord, you just have 1. Take it down, take it down, take it down, take it down. Absolutely pristine.
There's no question that Gould's obsessiveness had serious downsides. After he quit concert life, he really was unwilling to say a word in public that wasn't scripted. He insisted on writing both the questions and the answers for an interview. And there are film productions of his where he is reading scripts off cue cards in which he's trying to be chummy and personable.
What an odd instrument you've got there. I think it has a rather nice tone, actually. I'm talking about this thing now, which I don't know how to call it. Monsieur, you will not speak disrespectfully of a member of the family. How do you mean, member of the family? It is a boon traveling companion, without which I do not function. I cannot operate. It has been with me for 21 years. You've actually this thing, which is otherwise known as a chair. You've actually given concerts on this?
Back in the 50s, when he was giving these wonderful, spontaneous interviews, he could be wonderfully charming and personable. But when he put that personality through the ringer, you get the sense that he never realized that he was, in some ways, becoming less interesting to look at and listen to by so heavily controlling and scripting himself.
Everything went beautifully, but as time went on, the eccentricities became more and more important, and overshadowed, really, his personality.
The relationship with him, I think, must have been a little suffocating, for my mother. On one hand, it was very intense and engaged, and they just spoke every day for hours. But that's what I mean. He was known to speak for hours on the phone. She ended up relinquishing a part of her own herself and what she wanted to be in life for his sake. And I think it couldn't be any other way. Is really what I'm saying. That's what Glenn needed.
The last year, of course, became increasingly difficult. My life became more and more restricted as his paranoia became more evident. It really became impossible for me to do anything without being supervised, so to speak. Not being able to paint, which I really couldn't in Toronto, was a limitation I simply couldn't accept. He became more and more difficult, and I think that was due to the fact that he was taking antidepressants and anti-anxiety pills, and at the time no one really understood how tremendously dangerous these things were. And his personality began to change radically. There was less and less of Glenn, and somebody else began to emerge.
I think life was not easy for him. He had visions of things he wanted to do, perhaps of relationships he would like to have. But getting there was something.
Separated away. I mean, we were staying in separate houses, but we had pretty much gotten back together again. Glenn told me that he was coming down to see me. Well, he did not say, I'm coming down to see you in order to get you to come back. It turned out that that was the reason, but he... moment in my life. And that was the last time I saw him.
There remains an element of mystery to the whole relationship and this whole segment of my life, their life. So, and it's not as if anybody in my family is shy about talking about things, but, there are certain things that to this day don't entirely make total sense. But people lead sort of eccentric lives sometimes, and it doesn't have to make sense.
When I was researching Gould's biography, I quickly discovered that a lot of the Gould myths were exaggerations in some way or another. The one Gould myth that wasn't necessarily exaggerated was his hypochondria.
He was involved in a positive cocktail of pills. And I said to him a number of times, this is extremely dangerous to do. And he just would grin and say, oh, do you think so?
There was one episode with the border people who thought he had too many, shall we say, prescription drugs or not. He just had too many of them. And they actually, they stripped him.
The only diagnosis that he would never accept is the one that said, you've got to start eating right, you've got to start sleeping properly, you've got to stop taking so many pills. He just would dismiss it as nature boy stuff.
He had this enormous fear of going to hospitals. So when his mom was in hospital, he refused to go into the hospital to see her for no other reason than his fear of germs.
He talked to her all the time on the phone, but he didn't actually go to the hospital. And I myself, how can I put it, felt very uncomfortable about that. But who am I to comment?
Later, of course, after his mother died, he felt really upset and realized that the hospitals weren't full of germs. At least they weren't all aimed at him. And he felt really guilty about not going to see his mother, and it really hurt him a lot. I can remember spending hours when he talked about his gratitude and his feeling for his mother and how he felt he had neglected her when she was dying. I don't think he ever really got over that.
Glenn was very concerned about his father, Bert, because he was most incredibly lonely. And eventually he met Vera Dobson, and Bert married her. And I think for Glenn that was very hard to accept.
Glenn was furious. And I defended Bert. Bert was his own man and did his own thing and everything else, but you get married, you expect your family to be around, and when your son isn't, it bothered him a lot. These things happen between parents and kids, and sometimes it resolves themselves, sometimes they don't. People are people. And even if you're a famous pianist, you're still a people.
suspect that some of the appeal that Toronto has for me is gained by default, so to speak. I tend to follow a very nocturnal sort of existence, mainly because I don't much care for sunlight. Bright colors of any kind depress me, in fact, and my moods are more or less inversely related to the clarity of the sky on any given day. Matter of fact, my private motto has always been that behind every silver lining there's a cloud. So I schedule my errands for as late an hour as possible, and I tend to merge along with the bats and the raccoons at twilight.
Cycle by Lucas Foss. So the next morning, he called Mario Prizak, who was his producer for the Music Camera series, and said, "Who is this woman? And phone her and get her for me." I certainly was a little bit overwhelmed at the experience at the beginning, a bit nervous. So when we started rehearsing, he says, "Oh, you seem to want to take a little bit of time and pull this particular section." He says, "You know, it makes perfect musical sense." And with that, he freed me. And it became a collaboration. It was sort of like a journey. And there certainly was something magical about that.
Cornelia Foss, I'd never met the lady. There were a couple of other ladies, but it wasn't very close. Roxy was special, okay? Because of her collaboration and working together with Glenn. It was a very special relationship with her.
When I was working with him, people would be asking me about the gloves and so on. And, you know, they would even say that he sort of looks like a rubby-dub sometimes, you know. But in spite of all that, I found him the most glamorous person I knew. He rehearsed in his apartment, actually. It was always around 10 o'clock or something like that. Actually, at that point, I was very addicted to a program called Mary Hartman, Mary Hartman. So we would take a break, watch Mary Hartman, and then rehearse some more till about 1 o'clock or something like that.
She was trying to domesticate Glenn in a certain way, and she pulled a certain amount of it off, and he went along with it.
He loved animals, and one of his fantasies was to get someplace up in Manitoulin and set up a puppy farm and retire there. So we took a trip just to take a look around. We came across a field, and there were a whole bunch of cows, and actually started singing a little bit.
Must have said a dozen times, "These are the happiest days of my life." And he really meant it.
Perhaps the most outrageous thing that Glenn Gould ever did was to record the Goldberg Variations a second time. Many people said, "Oh, he's gone too far this time. He's more eccentric than he ever was." That people felt they weren't hearing the man that they loved play anymore, that suddenly there was a crazy guy on this new recording, and it is a different man playing. Now, the youthful vitality and virtuosity was replaced by a certain kind of thoughtfulness that I really appreciated. And although it is more eccentric, there's certain things that become more beautiful. It's a man who's pored over this music in every conceivable way and considered all the formal aspects of it and is bringing out more of the depth of the piece itself.
I think he would like to feel that in performing music, he presented it in the best and most convincing light. And if along the way it touched the hearts and minds of the people concerned, that would have been extraordinarily important to him. Glenn received many, many letters from people who were lonely, who had problems in their lives, who were very unhappy. And he had letters of gratitude. I mean, some of them said, "Mr. Gould, thank you, you've saved my life." This was part of him getting a certain fulfillment from life, which was very important to him, very important.
Glenn Gould, Canada's most famous classical pianist, is in hospital after suffering a severe stroke. He was 50 last Saturday. He had the stroke on Monday, and his family...
When he called me, I knew right away there's something, he had a stroke or something was desperately wrong. And I went over to the hotel room, and he got up and let me into the room. But his condition deteriorated after that.
He had his birthday on the Sunday. He had a stroke on Monday. Then he had several other strokes, and he was conscious one moment and fading into a coma the next.
I remember being with him down in the hospital, and he was getting more and more frantic and agitated, and I knew that I wasn't helping. I was making it worse. And to my dying day, I remember walking down the hall, and he was calling after me, but I knew I had to leave. And the next day he was in a coma. Then it was just a matter of time.
after all had been said and done, there was a silence, and then it seemed from around the walls, suddenly you heard someone singing. Well, it was Glenn. And so it was the aria from the Goldberg Variations. And when people realized that, a lot of people burst into tears. And when it finished, that was the end. It was goodbye, Glenn.
You have all of these narrative elements of a fascinating genius. But ultimately, there's a mystery at the heart of Glenn Gould. Every time you think that's what Glenn Gould was about, or that's what his life meant, it slips away into something else. And it's the inexplicability of Glenn Gould that keeps people coming back to him. You know, I think a lot of it comes down to this idea of being at home with yourself, finding a place where you're comfortable. And my belief is that ultimately Gould was only ever at home when he was playing music.
I think Gould wanted to be remembered as something other than just a pianist. He knew that that was his core achievement, obviously. But he wanted people to realize that there was a whole worldview, there was a whole philosophy behind these performances of his. I also think he wanted to be remembered as a genuinely creative person. He channeled a great deal of creativity into his interpretations, and I think he did achieve one of his goals, which was to be a kind of Renaissance man.
Beyond everything else, I hope his legacy would be that he made the world a better place.